Session 4, the intellectual expansion that took place in the late 12th and well into the 13th century. And I've organized this session and the next session around a contrast of the intellectual world opening in the early 13th century and then a closing of sorts, what I call a contraction, orchestrated really by the Vatican, but we'll talk about that next week. And so this one is called Intellectual Expansion, Philosophy, Literature, and Art, and we have a lot to cover. And so off we go to the races. So the first topic is philosophy. And I've referred to the resurrection of Aristotle from Arab sources as a signal point in this 12th and 13th century tradition. Aristotle became, for the Arab philosophers, the philosopher, as he was called. And in the Latin West, not much of Aristotle, just a few books of the logic, had made it through the early medieval period into Latin. And since they lost facility with Greek, they really didn't have access to Aristotle. And so they were, since the ancient world in the West, largely influenced by Plato. So Platonism, as I say in that top paragraph, mainly in the form of St. Augustine's Christian version, had dominated the West because only a few selections of Aristotle were known. With the success of the translation movement, the philosopher, as he's called, now became the rage in all the schools of Western Europe. The Aristotle of scholastic philosophy, as it's called, the philosophy as it was taught in the universities of the 12th and 13th centuries, arrived not only through several layers of translation, as we looked at last week with the translation movement, but with a heavy layer of Arab commentary and original embellished thought in the Arab world. And I've shown this before in other courses, Raffaello's great fresco, The School of Athens, it's in the Vatican. And there's two central figures on the left and right within that black circle. You have Plato, of course, classically pointed up at the realm of the ideas, and Aristotle pointing out to the material world because of the empirical bent and his trust of the senses that he brought to his theory of knowledge. The people we're going to focus on, and I've chosen three of them. I've chosen them because they're what in philosophical circles they like to call system builders. What fascinated the medieval world about Aristotle, Arabs, Jews, Christians, all of them, is that his philosophy explained everything. There is nothing that philosophy could possibly look at that Aristotle didn't have a theory of. It's a theory of everything. It was a grand system that integrated a theory of knowledge, epistemology, with a theory of the material world, of physics, with a theory of human society, politics, with a theory of individual behavior, ethics, and aesthetics. At its foundation, there was a theory of being itself, being qua being, as they like to say in the Latin phrase, metaphysics. The 12th and 13th centuries produced intellectual giants. The three people I want to look at: Averroes, a Muslim master philosopher, Moses Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher and Talmudist, and Thomas Aquinas. All of them using Aristotle as a model, as an influence, and as a guiding spirit. So the first of them lived his life actually entirely in the 12th century. Averroes, as the Latin world knew him, Ibn Rushd in Arabic. He was a court physician in Cordoba and later on in Seville and Marrakesh, You often find Muslim intellectuals of the 12th century and Jewish intellectuals of the 12th century who were in Spain making their way to Africa because, as we will talk more about next week, there was a fundamentalist revival in the Islam of the Almohads in Spain, which made the comfort zone of intellectuals much narrower. And so they head back to Africa and make their way back, in some cases, back to Egypt. But they had a better chance in Fez or Marrakesh than they would have in Cordoba, as we'll see. As a philosopher, Averroes was more popular and influential in the Christian world of 13th century Paris than in the Muslim world, because philosophy was being attacked as anti-religious in the Islamic world, particularly in the 11th century fundamentalist revival that I began to address. Averroes wrote extensive commentaries on Aristotle and Islamic theology in the attempt to harmonize reason with revelation, the great contrast of faith and reason, which is going to be a great bother to Christian philosophy and Jewish philosophy, as well as Islamic philosophy in this period, essentially because the argument will be suggested that Aristotle and the pagan philosophers make arguments about nature, make arguments about what is knowable, make arguments about the nature of revealed religion that contradict what is taught in either Islamic theology or Jewish theology or Christian theology. They're all going to have a problem here. And Averroes is one of the early ones to argue the theory of one truth. His argument was that conclusions using reason cannot contradict revelation. They're just two methods of getting there. Truth cannot, and a quote from Averroes, truth cannot contradict truth. When reason appears to contradict revelation, revelation, the sacred text, must be interpreted allegorically. So this has a tradition going all the way back to St. Jerome and St. Augustine in the Christian world in the 4th century. The idea that scripture needed figurative explanation. You couldn't take it literally. The earth didn't revolve around the sun in a way that God would stop it, as you see in the Bible. He made an argument about unity of intellect. The only reason I include this here is that he proposed a theory of intellect that would deny the immortality of the individual soul. The way he tried to square the religious revelation of the Quran and individuals going to heaven with the Aristotelian theory that individual humans die, but there is a kind of universal intelligence that maintains itself, is to do a little bit of a soft shoe with his theory of unity of the intellect. It became a major challenge to his attempt to reconcile the truths of reason and revelation. And one of the reasons why the Arab world is going to not regard him as much of a significant figure as the Christian world will later on, which is more, the Christian world becomes more comfortable with the idea, it's less fundamentalist and more comfortable with the idea of using allegorical or figurative interpretation to explain sacred texts, the Bible in the Christian case or the Jewish case. Now, some background before we start talking about Maimonides, a little context on Jewish culture in this period. From the ancient world on, there were always two major traditions in Jewish intellectual life. There was the so-called Alexandrian tradition. In other words, there was a philosophical school stemming from Philo of Alexandria that had roots in Neoplatonism, the same thing that was going on in Christian intellectual circles at exactly the same time. It was an attempt to reconcile Greek philosophy with Torah, and much the same secular spirit, if you could call it that, as St. Augustine and a millennium later, Averroes. The allegorical reading of scripture was central to the enterprise, and this approach severely declined under Christian persecution. So after Philo, we don't have all that much Jewish philosophy in that vein going on until we get into the Middle Ages later on again. Now, there always was the Pharisaic tradition, the Talmudic school. It's separatist. It can survive easily after falling victim to Christian persecutions in the ancient world. And it's legalistic. It prospered in the Carolingian age of the 8th century and 9th century and came to dominate Western Judaism. So the whole Talmudic tradition of European Judaism comes to the fore out of that splinter from the ancient world. Now, in the 12th century in the West, there is a crisis in the Jewish world, and it's precipitated outside of the Jewish context itself. There's a militant revival of the papacy and Christianity, which we've been talking about, which triggers a world of pogroms, of forced conversions, of the, as we'll talk about next week, an inquisition or several inquisitions, and ultimately ghettoization, which is really a European invention coming out of the 12th and 13th century. The anti-usury reforms of 11th century canon law, which was an internal Christian reform, and the First Crusade, coupled at about the same period, resulted in Jews becoming the money lenders. So ghettos were established as ducal and royal protectorates to protect Jews who were needed for the money lending capability in Western urban development. They needed bankers. Here was a group that were sort of forced into it because of the restrictions on Christians doing money lending, or restrictions on Muslims doing money lending that you would have found in Spain. And the ghettos were, and instead of a let's lock Jews in to keep them subjugated, the ghettos were a byproduct of protection, and by whoever the local secular Christian leadership happened to be in that period. What we wind up with, though, as a result, is that Jews are cut off from secular culture as a mainstream culture in Western Europe. By 1290, at a critical point, and this has to do with the closing of the European mind, if you will, Jews were expelled from England and France at about the same time. And this is the point at which they head to Germany and points east and develop a vibrant but inward-looking Yiddish culture, which is a result of their being forced out of France, out of Germany, and out of England. Out of France and out of England to Germany. And then later on, further east, because Germany becomes too much of a hot spot for their comfort. And a major thinker in this Jewish world that we're addressing here is Rashi, the famous Talmudist, the Shlomo Yitzhaki Solomon Isakides, Solomon de Troyes, French Talmudist, renowned for commentary that appealed to scholars and beginner students alike. And it's a typical sort of Jewish medieval scholarship. It's practical commentary. It avoids philosophical speculation and consideration of sources from outside the rabbinic tradition. So it stays pretty much at home. As a contrast to this is the great Musa ibn Maimon, or as the Arabs called the Musa ibn Maimon, the Rambam, Maimonides, as the Latin is called him. He's almost a colleague in terms of historical period with Averroes. He's also a physician. He's a polymath of the highest order. He's an astronomer. He's a rabbi. He is and the greatest Jewish philosopher, and one of the great Aristotelians of the Middle Ages. He's born in Cordoba, but with the ascension of the Almohad dynasty, and that dynasty abolished dhimmi status for non-Muslims. That was the status that said if you were people of the book, if you were Christians or Jews, you were given this special status according to which if you paid a tax, you were allowed to practice your religion, and you could have schools of your own religious disposition. And this is getting abolished. So people were being forced to convert or migrate. And he eventually migrates to Morocco. His house is still in Fez. If you ever get to Fez, Morocco, you can actually walk by this little street level house, and over the doorway, etched in stone, it says Musa ibn Maimon. And ultimately, he makes it to Cairo. Before his exile, he and his family may have done one of those pretended conversions to Islam to survive. And by the way, hearkening back to the lecture on the Crusades, in Egypt, he becomes the personal physician to Saladin. So he is a man of many parts. That portrait of him is an 18th century attempt. And you see him looking very Arabized, which of course he is. He is the preeminent Talmudist of the 12th century, renowned from Spain to Iraq as a decisor, that is, a scholar who gets to make rules. When the rabbis argue among themselves and they go to a grand rabbi for a final argument, a decision on a halakha, on religious law, he is one of those people. And he makes his ruling based on scriptural and oral tradition together. He writes a 14-volume Mishnah Torah written in Hebrew, and it still has canonical authority. People still refer to this. He's still quoted in those circles. Now, as an Aristotelian, he is the equal of Averroes and Thomas Aquinas. He argues, again, for the allegorical interpretation of scripture so that there can be only one truth, and any apparent contradictions are either a fault in your reasoning or an improper allegorical interpretation. It's got to be one or the other because they can't be in real contradiction. So in this case, what's being interpreted allegorically would be Torah in order to reconcile philosophy with revealed truth. Again, he writes a grand tome, the Guide for the Perplexed. It's written in Judeo-Arabic. It's classical Arabic using the Hebrew alphabet, as astonishing as that sounds. So he actually speaks perfect literary Arabic. He would have as an Arab intellectual. And the guide is Maimonides' great Aristotelian attempt. His willingness to consider Aristotle's argument for the eternality of the universe, which means that Genesis would be contradicted, which has God creating the universe ex nihilo, opens him to charges of heresy. He has to suggest several ways around that, but there are those in the Jewish community. If he weren't a great Talmudist, he probably would have been regarded as a Jewish heretic on the basis of the Guide for the Perplexed. His idea that God can only be described in negative terms, that is, because God is infinite in every way. And so the only way the human mind can try to grasp God is by talking about what God is not. And this gets fully adopted by Aquinas and other Christian philosophers. Aquinas makes a huge thing of this. And he gets it most decidedly from Maimonides. If we jump to the University of Paris now in the 13th century, so Averroes and Maimonides were figures of the late 12th, at the University of Paris, which becomes the center of philosophical and theological debate in the 13th century, to be followed by Oxford in the same vein, Averroism, as it is called, as it's adopted by the Christian world in the West, becomes a rage, a vogue. But it's a version of it that argues and blames it, by the way, on Averroes, a double truth theory, because they start doing a close reading of Aristotle that says, hey, gang, there's no way that you square Aristotelian secular philosophy with Christian revelation. They're just a contradiction. If you follow the logic of each, you come up with different answers, and that's it. And the group that adopted this at the university were referred to as the so-called radical Aristotelians, and they are banned and excommunicated, and their books burned by the very influential Archbishop of Paris at the time, Etienne Tempier. And the two most significant thinkers and interesting people in their own right, but we don't have time for that in our compressed class, are C.J. of Brabant in Belgium and Boetius of Dacia, which would have been, I guess, Dacia would have been the upper part of what we'd now call Croatia. Maybe it's even part of Austria at this point. And they believed that philosophical truth was incompatible with revelation. And of course, they blamed it on Averroes. The position was rooted in Aristotle's disagreement with church dogma on the immortality of the soul, point one, and point two, on the creation of the universe ex nihilo. Because there's nothing in looking at the universe, they would argue from Aristotle, that suggests that it came from nothing. Because every time you see an effect, there is a cause. And there would be a cause of the cause, and there would be a cause of that cause. And Aquinas tries to stand that argument on its head and says, well, you can't have an infinite regress. And therefore, I'm going to call, there is a God, and I'm going to call him the first cause, the uncaused cause. But that's off topic, so let's not go there. The great Christian philosopher and theologian of the 13th century, Aquinas, there are others, but he's a Dominican, he's an early, and I know we haven't spoken of St. Dominic yet, and we will even speak of Franciscans without having spoken of St. Francis yet, because we're going to get to both of those guys next week in another context. He's a Dominican friar. He becomes a doctor of the church, which is a big deal, a spokesperson for the theology of the church, major philosopher, major theologian, and a mystic, to whom all sorts of miracles and mystical visions and things of that ilk are ascribed. He creates a synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and traditional Augustinian, which is Platonic theology, that was breathtaking in its scope and originality. He's initially condemned by that same Archbishop of Paris as being an Averroist. But within a half century of his condemnation, he's canonized a saint, which is a gigantic 180 that occurs in this very compressed period of time. His grand work, his Summa Theologica, and sometimes called the Summa Theologiae, in his Summa, and Summa doesn't mean the top as much as it means the everything, accepts Aristotle's theory of knowledge, which essentially, the major difference between Aristotle and Plato is this great Aristotelian trust in sense data, that the first way you come to any knowledge is through the senses, not through some internal inspection of the seed of ideas that are planted in the soul from before birth, if you will. And I would point out, by the way, that certain modern linguistic theory is very Platonic in that it thinks that there are things that are, if you will, learned from the inside out, like the deep-seated structures of language. So people like Noam Chomsky would argue a kind of a Platonic view of certain things. But Aristotle was novel to the Latin West, in that he's arguing that knowledge comes outside in, and indeed, in his Summa Theologica, Aquinas is going to argue that by using logic, starting with sense data, and then by using logic and working analogically and deductively, you can build from simple learned conclusions from sense data, arguments to very high abstract truths, including, he makes the case, that the existence of God can be deduced by natural reason. He gives his famous 5 proofs, which we won't go into here, but that you can't know a lot about God via reason, because you can only use the methods of remotion. You can only talk about what God is not, as Maimonides pointed out. And therefore, you can't know much about God directly except through revelation. But natural reason can lead you to the conclusion that something must have caused this string of causes, or else you have an infinite regress, and that is, as he would point out, absurdum. It's absurd, and therefore there must be an uncaused cause. And he says that is what we would call God. It doesn't tell us anything about this God, but at least philosophy can take us part of the way. But as he points out, natural reason is limited. The nature of God and other revealed higher truths of faith are beyond our natural capacity and require the action of grace to be known. And therefore, theology, not philosophy, is the queen of the sciences. And so this grand intellectual, the most famous of all Neapolitan intellectuals, he at one point says, fairly early in his life, not that he lives that long, he dies at the age of 49, he was tremendously fat. I don't know whether this portrait does justice to that. When he's certainly in his late 30s or so, he says, well, now I really want to stop doing philosophy because it's boring, and devotes himself to the study of theology. And here we have a portrait, a 15th century portrait by the great artist from the Marche, Carlo Crivelli. Now, Aquinas, the Doctor Angelicus, as he was called, the angelic doctor, the Doctor Universalis, the universal doctor, he becomes adopted eventually, certainly by, I would say by the time he's canonized, as the intellectual last word in Roman Catholic theology. He's used as a bludgeon in arguing against Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation when we get to the 16th century. And he's shown to be this in all the periods of art that follow his elevation to the status of doctor. So here I can expand the view of these a little bit. You notice I love to show Francisco Zurbarán portraits of one kind or another. This is the apotheosis. He is being gathered into heaven where he gets to sit with the grand doctors of I think Aquinas is one of these guys, and he's taken into heaven as the grand intellectual with pen in hand and the Summa in his other hand. And then we have the triumph of Thomas, Benozzo Cazzoli from a much earlier period. And if you look down here, look who he's triumphing over. This is Averroes. So the falsehoods of the Muslim philosopher who was falsely thought to be arguing for a two-truth theory sits under the feet of Aquinas, crushed by the grand intellectual that is Aquinas. And here Diego Velázquez shows him being tempted, where he resists and remains chaste forever. And then a mystical account of Aquinas, the crucifix speaking to him. Mystical visions and episodes of even levitation are ascribed to Aquinas. In fact, I think the Zurbarán portrait is supposed to suggest a levitation. He was thought to have been observed doing this in his friary in Italy. Anyhow, it wasn't the heart of scholastic philosophy that taught at the universities became Thomism, Aristotelianism done up. But there was a challenge to it based at Oxford, and usually populated by Franciscans in opposition to the Dominican intellectuals of the University of Paris. And they had a lot to do also with the foundations of scientific theory in the same period. Actually, slightly later. You see their periods. By the time we get to Occam, it's slightly later. Certainly, Robert Grosseteste and Roger Bacon overlap with Aquinas. In the 13th century, under the direction of Franciscan scholars, Oxford University became the center for the study of scientific method and experimentation. And this statement that I have boxed here on this slide is incredibly important. Franciscan theology had a pronounced mystical bent. It was very Platonic. It was very Augustinian. It explained the knowledge of God as intuitive and immediate. Remember when we were talking about infused contemplation and Bernard of Clairvaux last week? Same thing. Ultimate knowledge comes as an act of grace, a flash, an epiphania, an epiphany, a dumbstruck moment, rather than as a process, a procedure that is mediated by deductive reasoning. Step A, step B, step C. They were predisposed to empiricism and inductive science. That the act of learning, that sensory, if you will, perception, induction based on perception, it's closer to the intuitive immediacy that ultimate knowledge of God is communicated through. So they were very disposed all through their history to, when they did real intellectual work, not just theology, to be very empirical in their approach. The first great empirical mind among them, Robert Grosseteste, an Englishman, He was the first thinker, other than Arab scientists, to stress Aristotle's dual paths of scientific reasoning. In other words, Aristotle had made a case for both deduction in his logic and induction in his physics. And deduction, you go from the universal idea to an application of that. You deduce another idea from it. In induction, you're moving in the reverse direction. You're moving from particulars to universal principles. You're starting off with lab observations and building up to a theory rather than working from a more general theory down to a more specific theory. And proceeding with experiments, these ideas were not only valid, but preferable in what they began to call natural philosophy, or what we would call science. Roger Bacon, Grosseteste's greatest student, and you see he's a good 50 years younger. Bacon elaborated what we have come to think of as the standard scientific method. He starts talking about the steps of observation, hypothesis, experimentation, and then independent verification. He documented his experiments in a way that enabled others to reproduce them on their own. And you see a little optics study of Bacon over here on the lower right. And then, of course, the great Franciscan philosopher, William of Ockham, who goes back, in effect, and picks up the mantle of Abelard and develops nominalism in a direction that has great impact for modern philosophy. Along the way, he adopts Occam's razor, which argues that the simplest possible explanation should always be applied and this was a valuable contribution to scientific method. Occam stands as in opposition to and as a critic of grand system building. There's a kind of humility to that which is knowable in Occam that you don't find so much in Aquinas. Anyhow, let's turn to one of the other great developments of this period, which is this period of expansion, which is the development of vernacular literature of every ilk and status. And the first that we engage in is the so-called Chanson de Jeux, songs of the great deeds of the heroes of our civilization. The earliest vernacular literature in the West were French epic poems that appear in the 11th and 12th centuries. They were sung or recited by jongleurs, itinerant minstrels. The subject material of the Chanson de Jeux was based on French history and is known even in the period as the Matter of France. And it's akin, the rivals are Arthurian legend, the Matter of Britain, as it's called, and classical mythology, the Matter of Rome. The world of Charlemagne supplied most of the input for the narrative content of the Chanson de Jeux. So we have the Song of Roland, for instance. And here are manuscript depictions from the Song of Roland, and here is an early illumination showing Charlemagne finding Roland dead. And it's about Roland is actually fighting the Baths on a retreat through the Pyrenees, and he's defending the rear guard of Charlemagne's army. Chansons focus on themes of vassalage. So they're up to their neck, deeply rooted in feudal structure, feudal social structure, vassalage and loyalty. And they were notably very violent. I mean, it was a lot of off with their heads, very pious, mawkishly sentimental. And an interesting point is that all these early epics had a kind of communal or folk message that they were conveying. They were the story of the people. The heroes are portrayed as central figures in the destiny of the nation, of the people, the folk. Later versions, chivalric romances, differed, and we're going to get to those right after this, and that they were often about individual heroism, individual psychology, individual love affairs, the individual sensibility. But these first early attempts were epic in proportion. These explored the later ones explored the knight errant on his quests, or the love lives and manners of the nobility. The chansons were in verse and intended for oral performance to be sung to an illiterate audience. They were early enough in time so that they would have been copied into manuscript that often with that many, expecting to be read by a large audience of readers. Stanzas were often formulaic. This is just like Homer and other epic Icelandic Eddas and things like this, where the reciter has many formulas, linguistic phrases that he can use to fill out the metric structure of the stanza. So he's singing a song, and basically all he has to do is remember the general story and have a formula, a phrase. So in Homer, when Achilles is called, Achilles of the strong arm, or Achilles of the wise counsel, it's that in Greek, those phrases have different numbers of syllables, which could be pulled out by the singer, the rhapsode, the oral performer, to fit the sentence in the stanza that he's in the middle of. Da 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 da. I need 4 syllables here. So I'm going to pull out this heroic epithet of Achilles rather than that one. Same thing is going on in the Chanson de Jeux. By the late 12th century, chansons were grouped in cycles around a common historical character. So you get the cycle of Charlemagne, for instance. The Nibelungenlied, the great German song, the song of the Nibelungs, the great national epic of the Germans, is exactly the same sort of thing. Its origin is in various oral traditions from the 5th century. In fact, Nibelung is a clan name for the Burgundian royal house. And I know you're thinking of the Burgundians as French, as Burgundy is French, but remember that the Franks were Germans. And the Burgundians of the 5th century would have been speaking a form of German. The characters, Siegfried, Kriemhild, Brynhilda, Gunther, Etzel, Hagen, all are traceable in Merovingian, that's pre-Carolingian, Visigothic, and Hunnish historical antecedents. They actually think they know who each of these characters is supposed to be. And you have appearances of people like Attila the Hun. The Nibelungenlied appears in various manuscripts from as early as 1200, but it would have been an oral tradition long before that, but seems to have been lost for about 200 years later on before being rediscovered, the manuscripts that is, in the 18th century, and causing this tremendous sensation in German-speaking countries. We have rediscovered the manuscripts of the songs of our people. The rediscovery coincided with the birth, if you can imagine, in the 18th century, of the Romantic movement. So as the Romantic movement, which has its most deeply felt moment in German-speaking places in Europe in the 18th century, at that same moment, they're rediscovering the Nibelungenlied and its sentimentalized idealization of the folk as the organic root of German nationalism. And so if you can imagine, it's just a short hop, skip, and jump to really lurid romanticism, the Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle, and the appropriation of the Nibelungenlied by the National Socialists or Nazis in the 20th century, and by Marvel Comics in the 20th century. So if we look at the artwork that I've included, we go from a medieval depiction from a manuscript of the death of Siegfried to a cover of the famous Wilhelm Furtwängler in the Berlin Philharmonic doing the Ring Cycle, to 18th century romanticized, or 19th century, I should say, romanticized portrait. Here's Kriemhild is accusing Gunther and Hagen of the death of Siegfried. And not to be outdone, Marvel Comics, which is probably where I got my first dose of the Nibelungenlied, once upon a time. All of a piece. Now, chivalry, which is a development in vernacular literature, which occurs in the 12th century. And it comes from an old French term used for mounted knight, or cheval's horse. Chevalerie would have been the mounted knights, and chivalry is abstracted from that word to denote a code of conduct for the feudal class that we have always called those who fight, the mounted aristocracy of the feudal period. It developed in the late 12th century. The code was a set of ideals for the nobility that amalgamated martial virtues. You had to show your willingness to do battle and to fight for virtue. Religious mysticism, and so we're going to get the whole grail overlay, the idea of searching for mystical things that promise the fulfillment of destiny for the knight on his quest, and romantic love, and the idea that the lover, the object of the affection, is someone who should be fought for and who should be mystically esteemed in this period of the feminine being placed on the pedestal, the chivalric pedestal for the first time. And so the two terms of courtesy and gentility develop out of the code. Since the chivalric code was aristocratic, it became an etiquette for the courts of that social class. So the behavior at the courts, if you had good courtly behavior, you had courtesy. You were courtly. You were courteous. And it described both the code and the place where the code took root. The venue for it was the court. And the practitioners of courtesy were gentle, which doesn't mean that they were soft in that modern sense of the use of the term. It meant that they were people of high birth. They came from the patrician class. The Latin word gens, on which gentle and gentility and gentleman and gentlewoman are based, is the word for clan. It meant you were noble. So when a Roman had three names, Gaius, Julius, Caesar, the middle name was the name of the gens of the clan. So he was one of the Julii. And Caesar or Caesar would have been of the particular family within that clan. And it meant that you came from people of importance. And here we have a picture up here of Ewain, which becomes Owen from the original Welsh, and Gatwin, because remember, the early British are the ones speaking Celtic Gaelic, and they're not Anglo-Saxons, they're pre-Anglo-Saxons. So the Arthurian legends are based on Celtic, which becomes later on Welsh tales. And here we have women observing their champions who were fighting symbolically for their lady loves and for the ideal. Courtly love, the romantic ideals of the code, were very quickly elaborated into an ornate set of conventions that was formalized in a book called The Art of Courtly Love, De Amore, by Andreas Capellanus, who's chaplain to Marie de France, who is the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII of France. And so that the court in southern France, the Provençal, the Occitan court of Aquitaine, becomes the center of a movement for practicing courtly love. And the poetry is rooted in that tradition. So you wind up with a tremendous, as I mentioned here below, you wind up with a tremendous amount of troubadour and troubadour's poetry that comes out of Provence in this period. Marie and Eleanor, Queen Consort of France and England, and mother, remember, and how is this for a courtly name? Richard Coeur de Lion, Richard the Lion Heart, made the court at Poitiers, their capital, famous as the court of love. The Provençal troubadour and troubadour. So you had male singers and performers, and you had female composers, singers, and performers. And here you see them, the troubadours. At the Occitan court, lyric poetry was the order of the day, and these were the superstars of the day. And the art form quickly spreads through Europe. So we wind up with minne singers in Germany and trouvères and trovadorismo, everybody being called something else depending everybody latching on in their own language to the tradition. As Don pointed out in his chat, we learned the ballad of the Chevalier de la Table Ronde, and we'll get to those. We'll get to the round table very soon. Now, extrapolating the idea of courtly love in a world in which marriage was strategic. Remember, noble marriage was strategic. So Eleanor, who has no love for her husband, the King of France, and goes on the crusade with him and does not bear him a son, is easily dispensed with. The marriage is annulled. And she marries Henry Plantagenet, the heir of Anjou, in England, where she has Richard the Lionheart and John as her sons. And they're marriages of dynastic concern. So the convention of courtly love, which was supposed to be real love, romantic love, was that it could only exist outside of marriage. It was illicit, but ennobling. It was erotic, but spiritual. It was passionate, but morally edifying. The participants might quiver with desire, but would subordinate it to the discipline of service. The night was to be dedicated, valiant, honorable, devoted to fulfilling whatever ordeals and quests his mistress required as proof of his ardor. The sexual element was always close to the surface, but expressed as spiritually sublime, the ineffable, an ideal as high as ineffable and inexpressible and unknowable as the Grail. Something to go to the ends of the earth in pursuit of. The Knight's Lady is a mystical goal and an object of yearning and an emblem of the Holy Mother herself. All of these things. She's sexual object. She's a mystical goal. And so we see the lady and knight here, and she's putting the helmet on him. And of course, in later romantic, this is from the Victorian period, the accolade, the lady is dubbing her lover. And it's all Guinevere and Lancelot at root. Now, my comment here, romantic love, and in some ways, in its idealized modern form, is really invented in this period and resurrected again in the 18th century. It's a liberation of the individual from the self-defined subjection to authority. It's being able to break out of the constraints of the medieval worldview. It is, when I say this is a moment of intellectual expansion that we have here in the late 12th, early 13th century, this is at the heart of it. Not only is religious piety a opening to a breaking out, so is romantic love. It is a new expression of self-consciousness and personal feelings. The constraints of the feudal and church hierarchies are overthrown and a quest for self-realization. So as the new piety tries to throw off, if you will, the temporal and political manifestations of a rigid church, so is the new romantic love throwing over the constraints on the individual personality, and the turning to personal religion is also a turning to romantic love simultaneously. Chivalric romance as an art form, by the late 12th century, the romantic ethos of courtly poetry found abundant subject matter in the legendary characters of the early sagas. So what were once simple stories of heroes doing battle evolved into these elaborate narratives that reflected the love interests and mystical quests of the new sensibility. So especially when we get to the Arthurian cycle, it's all about the love triangle of, among other things, of Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot. And by far the greatest source for the growing literature was the matter of Britain, Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And so this cornucopia of Celtic myth, from which we get Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot and Tristan and Isolde and Gawain and Ewain and Percival and Galahad and Merlin and Morgan Le Fay and Uther Pendragon and Tom Thumb and the Black Knight. All the characters are there. And from the 12th to the 15th centuries, writers mining Arthurian legend just sprout up everywhere. I couldn't even, if I wanted to do this list justice, it would have taken up the rest of the slide. Chrétien de Troyes, Geoffrey of Monmouth, Wolfram von Eschenbach, Gottfried von Strasbourg, Thomas Malory, Geoffrey Chaucer even has a moment of that in The Wife of Bath. And of course, the greatest writer of them all, Anonymous, from whom we receive many of these love poems. And the Grail, variously described as a cup or stone with miraculous powers that provides happiness, eternal youth. If you find this, you will live forever, spiritual fulfillment. There's so many stories about it that there is no answer to the question, what is the Holy Grail? And some of the stories, it is the cup that, I have a typo there, that Christ used at the Last Supper, and is often in the possession of the Fisher King. The Grail and the Knight's Lady Love form a suggestive parallel, since both are ineffable objects of desire. Now, the quest is taken up by several figures, and in the lore, in the Arthurian lore, three of them actually get there. Galahad makes it to the Grail, Sir Bors makes it, and Parsifal, or Percival in the English version, gets there. And here we have a medieval illumination of Percival first being greeted by the Fisher King, and the Grail is inside, I guess. And this is from a manuscript of the Percival, the Story of the Grail by Chrétien de Troyes. Another major literary output of this tradition is a famous work. And the reason I include it here is that it was the most widely read romance of the High Middle Ages. There are more manuscripts of this than everything else combined. It is the Romance of the Rose. This is the sort of their X-rated version of the romance. It was started by Guillaume de Lorry, and Jean de Meung finishes it off. It's a psychological allegory of romantic love, the mirror of love. But it's more an allegory of physical love than it is romantic love or sexual love. The rose is the name of the lady as well as a thinly veiled symbol of female sexuality. In reaction to the courtly tradition, women are depicted as either seducers or sexual objects. And all the characters are named for strategies in a love affair. And here in this image that you see in the lower right, the characters of mirth and gladness lead a dance. This is in some illustration of the rest of the rose that's in the Bodleian at Oxford. So it's basically a handbook of seduction and conquest in both directions. And its blatantly sexual character left it open to all sorts of accusations of misogyny. And so these accusations were made as early as the 14th century. So the great letter writer, Christine de Pizan, 14th century feminist, self-conscious feminist, attacked the book as a promotion of deception. Here's another manuscript illumination. The god of love locks the lover's heart, big key going into the lover's heart, and the god of love. Now, this was also the moment at which, because it was a vernacular literature that was emerging in the period, that forms of high vernacular begin to develop. And with no parallel to it, there is the Divine Comedy of Dante. This is, I suppose, easily the greatest literary work of the Middle Ages. That's literature as literature. And it stands at a crossroads, and it could only have taken place in that area of high urban culture in north central Italy, because there the Italian Renaissance was going to get its first expression. And this is a very early, perhaps, vanguard of that Renaissance happening, even though the great tradition of the Italian Renaissance is a return to Latin as a literary language and the classical sources as a literary language. So he stands athwart the peaks of the rediscovery of classical Latin and its iconography and tradition, the church and its highest, if you will, medieval expression as the institution that is the social parallel of the entire universe in its grand hierarchy. You see the mountain in back of Dante, the Purgatorio, and the vernacular tradition and the elevation of the language of most people. as something that could be joined with these visions of religion and church piety, romantic love, and yearning for, if you will, the ineffable, the desire for heaven and the paradiso. Everything comes to fruition in one grand document that is in and of itself instrumental in establishing the Tuscan dialect as Italian. Italian takes its form from this moment. So, as I point out here, the High Middle Ages meets the Italian Renaissance. As with the development of Italian painting in this period, the border between the two historical designations is blurry. The vision of the afterlife as a hierarchy of Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso is a product of the medieval world order. Its devotion to deep piety and religious symbolism is a perfect reflection of the zeitgeist, that moment in time. On the other hand, Dante's resurrection of classical models, Virgil is his guide, and the Aeneid is his guide, is perhaps the signature Renaissance trait. And his depiction of fully developed human characters is decidedly modern. So here he is poised between the mountain of Purgatory and the city of Florence, and this depiction from the 15th century by Domenico de Michelino. And he's holding the book open, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, in the middle of the journey of life. Here I am, below the heavens, with his beloved Firenze on his side. I wish we had, this is worth a whole course in and of itself, is it not? Maybe sometime. Anyhow, let's leave literature for a moment and turn to painting. We've looked at philosophy in this period and its expansion, vernacular literature and its expansion. And now let's see what's going on in the world of painting. So in the 13th century, coming into the 13th century, the style as it was known was the maniera greca, the Greek manner. The dominant style, also called Italo-Byzantine, heavily influenced by Byzantine icons. The paintings were predominantly on wood panels and, as in Greek painting, highly formalized. The religious themes of Italian painting included both the traditional Madonna and Child that you see everywhere, of Byzantine iconography, but increasingly branched into composed biblical scenes. So we have an early mid to late 13th century Annunciation, Guido da Siena. I'll blow these up for you in a second. The central schools for Italian painting at the time were based in Florence and Siena, and not coincidentally, these are two of the capitals of economic expansion and civic wealth. And since we've been looking at the years between, really so far, between 1100 and 1300, next couple of weeks we're going to be branching even further. Since we're looking at that period, and I began talking about the economic expansion of the period, it is not an accident that artistic and literary and philosophical expansion happens in the centers and close to the centers for that economic development and expansion. You needed civic wealth. You needed civic wealth to build cathedrals, to support painters, to produce poets, to build universities that could teach Aristotelian philosophy. You needed a London and a Paris. You needed not monasteries isolated in the mountains. All of this new stuff is happening as an urban development. And that's where we began the course, as you remember. So if we look at these a little more closely, so we have from a painter known as the Master of St. Bernardino, very early Duecento, 13th century in Italian, Virgin and Child, looking very, very Byzantine in style. They begin to branch out into these staged annunciations, these staged biblical settings. Here's another Madonna early on by Coppo di Marcovaldo, 1265, also looking very Byzantine, but also beginning to look a little not Byzantine simultaneously. And the introduction, as we get into the late 13th century and possibly very early into the 14th, the introduction of naturalism and perspective are beginning to be established. So we'll see some things like Cimabue, some artists, the great Florentine artist who still is Duecento and was a tremendous teacher of and influencer of the great Giotto, who we'll see a lot of next week. So there were two masters, one in Florence, working. They were still sort of within the Italo-Byzantine style, but they were pioneering the use of this greater naturalism and perspective. And the other one who we'll look at in the ensuing slides is an old favorite of mine, Duccio di Buoninsegna of Siena. Again, the great cities of, two of the great cities of, commercial cities of the Italian late Middle Ages, high Middle Ages. So here we have Cimabue, a virgin enthroned with angels, done around 1280. And you begin to get more of an expressiveness in the face. Certainly in this is his crucifix at Arezzo. You certainly see more of an expressive face there. Not to mention the stylization in the body that you begin to see. And the wonderful abstract design that he lends to all of it. And then, of course, because his later life coincides with the early life of the great Francis of Assisi, we have this great early portrait from the 1280s of Francis. Anyhow, and let's move to the great Duccio. Again, in Duccio, you'll see both aspects dramatically represented, because he's a little later than Cimabue. You'll see not only very naturalist expressions on faces and facial rendering, but you'll begin to see sort of geometrical dimension as they begin to play with the idea of perspective. This Madonna on the right comes from the Maya style, which is a grand altarpiece. I just wanted to focus on the faces of the mother and child, and not to mention the elaborate robe work that you'll see. So just being able to do this quality of work in this period is just astonishing. And Duccio, yet again, so we have here a Christ being brought before the Jewish judge Caiaphas. He does this in 1308 to 1311 in that period. And again, the faces are rendered marvelously. I pick one out of another one of his fragments. This is from a triptych of his, and it's the prophet Ezekiel. On wood panels still here. And note the early attempt at architectural perspective, and you realize that we're still not up to Piero della Francesca, who gets it perfectly, and they master the vanishing point theory of perspective. This is sort of okay, and we're getting there, and we will make it all the way, I imagine, fairly soon. And the last slide, again, it's still Duccio. We have an enunciation. They have marvelous Duccios in all the major cities. You can find one or two in New York. But if you're ever on the road traveling, go looking at the medieval section, because the rendering of holiness with the golden corona is always so signature, and it's always done with this gold leaf. It's really wonderful. But again, architectural dimension and this fragment of the apostles appearing to Christ from a much larger work. I always like to focus on the details, and the robes in the hands are beginning to come along. We're moving quite a ways away from pure Byzantine icon. Anyhow, that is our class for the day. I'm going to stop the share, and I am going to unpin myself. And if people have, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question or make an observation or chat a question, feel free.
Lou?
Yes, ma'am.
It's Lori. I had a question about the development of perspective. Was there anything happening with either tools for artists that, you know, sort of led them into appreciating perspective?
I think the answer to that is yes, but I don't have the answer myself. In other words, I think that things like camera obscura techniques and stuff like that began to be experimented with early on, but I don't know how early.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't know whether the influence of elaborate architecture being available everywhere with the skills involved in that, with plumb lines and stuff like this, began that knowledge began, that engineering knowledge began to be disseminated and began to be interesting to painters as well. You know, that's a good question. My guess is it had to be.
Right.
Yeah, we just have to have been that way. That's an interesting observation. Anybody else? Now you're all just champing at the bit to go run off and read Romance of the Rose, I can tell. Anyhow,
I like the description you give of the paintings, the detail about the paintings, which was great.
Thank you. We're going to see a lot of painting next week, biased towards, you know, the great thing about being the organizer of the presentation is that I get to curate what I like. and there are like 500 people to choose from, but you know, I'll go with who I like.
Thank you.
Anyhow, okay, gang, next week it is heresy, born again religion, inquisitions, the closing of the European mind in different ways, the rise of the Franciscans and the Jesuits, sort of bad news for European Jews wherever they find themselves. It's a laugh a minute. We'll get there. Anyhow, see you guys next week.